The SCP Foundation is an impressive thing. For those that might not know, it is basically a fan-created wiki of sorts that tracks strange, bizarre, and often dangerous beings, coming up with entire stories through listing how these beings are contained, and a vague description that offers just enough to light up a reader's imagination, but never enough to give the reader a clear picture of what exactly it is they might be reading about. As such, the SCP Foundation website has become a wonderful source of not only creepy horror stories, but also of inspiration for horror games. In the past, we've largely seen games adapting the fiction of the SCP Foundation through more generic horror mechanics. These titles tend to feature one or two of the iconic creatures from the SCP website, with SCP-173 being an especially popular subject since it tends to make for an appropriately spooky experience, with the thing chasing you can only do so if not being observed. SCP Fragmented Minds, however, manages to carve out its own identity from the sea of SCP adaptations by leaning more heavily into the idea of being an action game. Make no mistake, however, SCP Fragmented Minds still has aspirations of being a horror title. In fact, much like its predecessors, you won't find much in the way of combat here either. You do, however, get ways to fight back against some of the strange creatures that you'll find roaming around as you explore a Mars outpost after some sort of cataclysm has happened. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's first understand the setup. You are Agent Kovich, a member of the SCP Foundation's security team, currently setting out on your first posting to Mars Site 113. While the purposes of the site aren't quite clear yet, you do know that you'll have to deal with some level of combat, since you were put through a rather rigorous training regimen. Other than that, however, the mission to Mars seems like a relatively cozy gig. Little do you know that things are about to go horribly wrong.
Traeger. Come in, Traeger. This is Kovich. What's your status, over?
A series of subterranean earthquakes have managed to mess up Mars Site 113 quite a bit, and by the time you're awoken in your cryopod, the whole Martian settlement is seemingly deserted. Slowly exploring through some wreckage and even the surface of Mars ultimately leads you into finding one other survivor, who is then able to let you get deeper into the SCP facility to try and reconnect with your team. All in all, the story and general setup of SCP Fragmented Minds is relatively simple, and acts pretty well as an excuse to throw you into the thick of it. The only real complaint I have with the game is that the start is just a bit too slow. While the general visuals and atmosphere are pretty good in the game's opening hours, things start getting a bit boring when all you're doing is walking around and trying to find the way forward. There's literally zero tension until you get around an hour into the game. Sure, there are some tutorials you get in the opening minutes. The pacing in general could be handled much better than what we ultimately got. Good thing it's still an early access title. The same pacing issues also apply to the gameplay. For a game with aspirations of being an action horror title rather than a stealth horror one, you don't even get access to a weapon until you're a couple of hours in. By then, you've faced plenty of instances of SCP-3199 that you've had to sneak your way around. And even when you finally do get a weapon to try and fight them off, you're going to be able to, at most, take on one at a time. This doesn't even feel like a case of forcing you to conserve your resources as much as it feels like poor pacing. Speaking of which, there isn't really much in the way of enemy variety in SCP Fragmented Minds. You're largely going to be sneaking around or fighting off various instances of SCP-3199. While this does mean that you get to experience creatures in an SCP title that aren't just what you've seen before, the lack of just about any other kind of enemy to fight against does more harm than good to the general sense of poor pacing throughout the game. This is an issue that, once again, looks like it'll get fixed down the line as the title gets more chapters through future updates. One key area where SCP Fragmented Minds absolutely excels in is its visuals. Mars Site 113 has been beautifully realized, with just about every dark crevice, nook, and cranny being rife with the potential for hidden terrors lurking around. The atmosphere is also top-notch, with a lot of work being done by the game's excellent use of lighting and volumetric fog effects to ramp up the tension. Being an early access title, however, does bring with it some clear technical issues. For instance, I often found myself needing to shut down and restart the entire game because it would refuse to load a room behind a locked door. I also had a lot of trouble grabbing footage for the game, with constant crashes happening whenever I started recording gameplay. Now, whether these issues are intrinsic to the game or if it was an issue related specifically to my hardware setup is currently unknown. Generally speaking, SCP Fragmented Minds definitely has its fair share of problems, be it the poor pacing or technical issues. Aside from that, however, the game feels like it's a solid foundation for what could be one day an excellent action horror title. The atmosphere is wonderful, and the fact that the title will be making use of some of the lesser known beings from the SCP Wiki means that we're in for some wonderfully weird and unique encounters in future updates.
That looks like it did something.
It did? Why was that power cord just ripped out of the socket? Go find some more. That might be enough to reboot the system.
As it stands, however, SCP Fragmented Minds is a difficult game to recommend. The pacing issues alone means that you're going to be spending the vast majority of your time with the game just running around and hiding from goofy-looking creatures. The roadmap, however, makes me think that there is a lot of promise in the game's future, and multiplayer is an especially interesting feature to keep an eye on down the line.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.